I did this Slack post where I updated you about all the resources, where to find everything. So the important thing that I want to tell you is that in your replication targets, you're not replicating the whole article, you're replicating specific studies in those articles. So make sure that you check the syllabus in order to identify which studies you need to replicate. You don't need to do beyond that. But by now, because of the RR assessments and all of the resources, hopefully you have some experience in what a replication looks like, how to think of and design an extension. And now you're ready to tackle your biggest assignment, the biggest task of this course. It has actually three stages. We separated the task into part 1 and part 2. Part 2 builds on part 1. And then after part 2, you'll have a chance to, of course, get some feedback from us and do a revision. And the end of the revision is middle of December. So basically from now until middle of December, you'll have a chance to work, improve, get feedback, slowly build it to the point where you'll do a full replication and extension registered report, stage 1. This week was the tutorials are about using Qualtrics. We had one from last year. And Christy also added this week a really good example of how to use Qualtrics based on a real scientific project that was done in a thesis by Kit, who is also helping some of your projects and supporting you as a guide, although he graduated already. So Kit's thesis about action and inaction and his very simple extensions of that, which is what he did for his MPhil. So Christy takes you step by step, how to look at this at the OSF, how to download the QSF, how to upload the QSF into Qualtrics, how to look at the survey flow, differentiate between different sections, what is the replication, what is the extension, and then look at all the best practices of how to do Qualtrics well. So all the randomizers, the recoding. So if you really want to see a good example of how to do these things, then just follow the tutorial from this week. I think at this point, we started off 3-4 years ago with basically no resources whatsoever. So students had to figure everything out for themselves. I think at this point, we're at the stage where we have too many resources. We have a lot of documentation and all of them require some time and exploration and for you to dig in and lots of videos. So I know it can be overwhelming, not that easy. Sometimes it's difficult to find things. So I tried in the Slack message and in the replications guide to give you a step-by-step, but I know it's difficult to find things, which is what I want to say, that we are here to help you and support you. So if you have any questions, we're trying to be very responsive. So if there's anything that you want to ask, something is not clear, if you're working on something and it takes you too long to find the information, ask us. That's the easiest way to go about this. I don't want you to spend a lot of time looking for information. I want you to spend most of your time working on your replications and extensions. So lots of guides, lots of tutorials, lots of workshops. Plus, for those of you who are proficient perhaps with SPSS, unfortunately, or better off Genovese, but you're afraid of R and you don't know how to deal with R, the end of next week, so Friday the 29th, I'll make another announcement of that. I'll give a workshop, not just for you, but for the entire HKU community on, it's called the R is easier than you think, time to move to R. That's the name of the workshop. On how to really simply start with R, how to take you step by step, and how to show you that R actually is very advanced now. So it has point click, a bit like Genovese. There's ways for you to do things very simply with copy paste of one line of code that does remarkable plotting. So if you're scared of R, something is stopping you from doing R, but you want to know how to do that a little bit better. So it's going to be not this week, but next week's Friday. 3-hour workshop. You don't have to do the whole thing. Plus, of course, I'll upload this to the YouTube. And in general, I have to say, if you're planning on not just being a psychologist, but maybe data analytics or something in industry, R is the way to go. So you want to know R. So it's a good way to kind of dive deep and go into that. So if there's somebody in your team that knows R, but you're like a little bit hesitant, but you want to work with them or learn from them, so this is a good opportunity for you to do that. So we're offering you some skills in this course that go beyond, science, open science, replications, extensions, but also getting some more experience with actually doing some data analytics and basic R skills. Lots of examples from previous years. So if you want to see how the other students did this, some of these replication targets you've already looked at, so you're welcome to go and have a look at this. This week, we're going to go deeper into social psychology. So we're moving slightly away from all the issues about where science is and what's happening. And we're going to discuss deep, fundamental, philosophical questions that now we have the methods and the ability to look into those in social psychology. If you've taken fundamentals of social psychology or introduction to psychology, probably you've had a few, you've talked a little bit about the findings in social psychology that tell us about human nature. So the basic fundamental question in social psychology is, who are we? What are we about? Where do we come from? What is inside us? What is our true nature, our real nature? So the fundamental question that we'll be discussing today is, are we good or bad? And we'll revisit some of the classic findings in social psychology. We'll start with, I'd like your input on this. So open your mobile or your laptop and help me out with the Mentimeter. We have some very basic questions for you because I want to get some of your intuitions on that. So menti.com 5067 45 3. And I want you, based on your own beliefs, you believe that human nature is inherently good, bad, or you're not sure. All right, good. The second question that I want you to reflect on is, you've taken a course in psychology, you know a little bit about psychology. So based on the findings from social psychology, the way that you understand them now, what do you think that social psychology says about human nature? The social psychology says about human nature that we're mostly good, mostly bad, or not so sure. Another question that I want you to reflect on, and please give me your intuitive gut reaction. So imagine that you can do anything humanly possible with complete assurance that no one will ever find out or know about this ever. What would you do? So it could be anything whatsoever. So this is one example of a method that we sometimes try and do in our experiments in order to elicit what people are thinking of. Now, when you see this kind of thing, I want you to put the scientist hat. What categories do you think we'll have as answers? Criminals. Okay, so like very negative criminal behavior. Okay, in this class as well? Maybe. Okay, good. Thank you. You wanted to say something? Criminal behavior? As a category, or is what most people will say here? Oh, if we do a good thing, we want people to know, but we all have something inside us that thinks about criminal behavior or something that's a bit more evil. Why is that? Why is that we want, like, why is it so important that other people will see our good behavior, but we hide our bad behavior? Social desirability? Yeah. First of all, what is a negative behavior? I don't even know. Criminal, I understand. I don't know about what negative is. What in your eyes is negative? Good, thank you. So already we have like two categories. We have criminal behavior that's very like unethical. And then you're saying maybe something that's deviant, but is not necessarily criminal. It's just people expect us to act a certain way because there are social norms, but we might deviate from that. Good. So the next question that I want to ask you, I won't show these results, but I want you, based on what you answered here, to tell me code different categories. So based on what you answered in the previous question, please code this as prosocial, helping others, antisocial, hurting others and doing bad, perhaps criminal behavior, or non-normative, like deviant behavior, but it's not about hurting others or anything criminal, just something that's non-normative, or something that is neutral. So to get your categories on this. So by looking at this, we can see the differences between, perhaps, this question reflects what happens in the interaction between who we are, who we think we are, and society overall. So social norms, the way that we behave in society, the way that we interact with other human beings is affecting us. Last question that I want to ask you for now before I show you some of the results is, please rank good or bad. -100 is very bad, +100 is very good. I want you to think about yourself. Are you good or bad? And then University of Hong Kong students, good or bad? And then people in Hong Kong as a society, good or bad? And then people around the world overall, altogether, good or bad? While you're answering this, I'll go back. We have a very, very small sample. Human nature, most of you thought inherently bad, but some of you believed inherently good. With some people that are really not very sure. How does this relate to our findings in social psychology? Mostly bad or not so sure. We have a little bit of, larger sample here. So it seems like there is some alignment between what we believe and some of the social psychology findings, but it's very balanced, 5 here, 4 here, 5 here, and then 5 that are not so sure and a little bit confused about this. So it's not like we have a very clear picture of what's happening. It's not like we have a consensus of like everybody is good and everybody is bad. I won't show the answers over here, but I will show the codings. What do you think the coding is going to be? So based on your prediction, what do you think most is going to be? Non-normative is the highest. Okay. Antisocial, how about criminal behavior and all that? Together are going to be the bulk of the whole thing. Okay. How about the positive ones? None at all? Nothing? 0? Okay. Okay, so we have like 2 neutral, 3 prosocial, 3 antisocial, and 5 non-normative. So you're definitely right that most of the people here are 5-3, like 8 of them are more of the antisocial non-normative, and you're right that non-normative is the biggest category here in our very, very small sample. But actually this sample is quite representative. And most times you're right, when I run this in big classes, it does seem that intuitively what comes to mind, the first thing that comes to mind is that people are like, I've always wanted to do this bad thing, but I couldn't because I was afraid that people will find out. We have 2 elements. One is that, people will judge me a certain way or think something about me. And another aspect of society is that they will punish me because, as a society, if it's criminal behavior, then there's punishment to go along with that. What do you think the results are going to be here before I show you? What are your predictions as scientists? What do you think happens when people compare themselves to other people in Hong Kong University or Hong Kong or the world? Let's start with which side is it going to be? More to the right or more to the left? More to the right. Okay. You as well? More to the right? These predictions, all of them or just specific categories here? Ourselves are positive and the rest are negative? Is that your prediction? What's your prediction? All of them positive. Okay, and what's your prediction about your classmates or generally what people would do here? Like you or a little bit different? Neutral, more towards the center? Okay, yeah. Any predictions about the differences between those? Are there going to be differences between how people rate themselves and how they rate other people? Okay, you want to increase your goodness. Contrast. So you push people towards the left, the more negative part. Is that your intuition as well? That people are going to contrast themselves towards against others? So you expect big differences between self and other? Not so big. Somewhat, yeah. But there are going to be differences between self and other, right? You as well? Higher or lower, but on the right. Is that what you think as well? Similar? Yeah, so the differences is the level of identification that you have. So HKU, you identify very strongly, it's part of your identity, so closer to how you rank yourself. But the broader we go, the more generalized, you will shift to which side? Towards the bad side. Yeah, so you and your in-group and the people that you identify with higher compared to, okay, let's have a look. Yeah, so kind of interesting. So the top ones are, of course, us. I am. There's one here and one here. Oh, wow. So people, I've never seen that one before. Somebody who puts themselves at minus 100. Interesting. I hope it's not like screwing around with us, but okay. But we can see that aside from this one person, all of us see ourselves as very, very positive. But then it goes down to HKU, slightly deviating from your prediction, right? You expected like as the broader we go, but definitely we can see that most people in Hong Kong, most people around the world, positive. So your prediction about all of us being to the right, afterwards you said maybe more to neutral, but definitely most of the people here are shifting towards the right, which is not so much in line with this. So here you had a prediction that all of us have these like evil side, but then we have this contradiction here. How to align these two things, or how to align this even with the first one, that most of us are inherently bad. So in one question, when I had to get you to not rank continuously, but you had to choose, some of you were confused, but many of you said bad. But then when we shifted here, so that most of you are good. What would explain this? How to explain this kind of contradiction? Different criteria? Okay, good. So we have perspective to take into consideration here. That's good. Any other thoughts about what's the difference between the first question about inherently good or bad, and then the question is, are you good or bad? What's the difference between these two? So something to think about and reflect over here. I think to me, this shows the complexity. Sometimes if we ask a choice, are you good or are you bad? People answer a certain way. When we give them a continuous variable, it's like you can rank yourself. So people tend to like use the scale a little bit more. And then we see when we try and, is everybody inherently good, inherently bad? And then we break this apart to me, others, the in-group, the out-group. Sometimes we get different answers. So just asking people, are people inherently good, inherently bad, is very complex. It's very difficult to answer with a questionnaire, especially like this. But we need to break this apart a little bit. And once we do this, we do tend to see some patterns. So if we run this on large samples, and I did run this on large samples, you do see this difference, this contrast that you were talking about between self and others. And I did find support for what it is that you predicted, is that the further away we go from the in-group that we identify with, the less good we see them to be. Plus, there's more noise. There are more people in the world. In HKU, maybe we know a lot of people, so we know them personally, and they seem to be generally good people. We have some experience in the interface, the interaction with them. People around the world, 8 billion people, we don't know who is there. So there's more noise embedded in that. Therefore, we compensate and we see them as shifting more towards the left. Okay, another question, and I'll tell you why I'm asking this in a bit. It's a scenario. We call this scenario it's a methodology in social psychology, but we use this scenario a lot in experimental philosophy. So we ask you to imagine a world, and then we ask you which of these two worlds that you imagine is closer to the world that we live in right now. So here we go. Imagine an airplane makes an emergency landing and breaks into 3 parts. As the cabin fills with smoke, everybody inside realizes we've got to get out of here. What happens? Now we've got 2 planets. On planet A, the passengers turn to their neighbors and ask if they're okay. Those needing assistance are helped out of the plane first. People are willing to give their lives, even for perfect strangers. Planet B, the opposite contrast to that, everybody's left to fend for themselves, very selfish behavior. Panic breaks out. There's lots of pushing and shoving, children, the elderly, and people with disabilities get trampled underfoot because they are the weakest. So on one side, we've got planet A, other side, we've got planet B. The question is, which planet do we live on? What do you think most people would answer here? So a different methodology. The first question that we had is like, are you inherently good, inherently bad? And people are like, okay, I don't know. I can think of all sorts of things, right? You know, some people think, okay, maybe criminal behavior, maybe deviant behavior. You haven't specified this. But now I'm giving you a very specific kind of scenario because I want to tap into some of the specific intuitions about this. What am I doing here? What's different about this scenario? Life-threatening? Yeah. Yeah. So very extreme situation, and then contrasting two very different behaviors, really forcing you to kind of make an evaluation. What happens in extreme situations? Can you think of a different situation in real life that you've read about or experienced yourself that was close to this, where people come from? Yeah, can you remember specific events that come to mind that you saw in India or the West? So you mentioned cultural differences or maybe background or level of education and how people would react. Interesting. So let's see what you wrote about this, what you did over here. Show the image. Planet B. So I think not only here, but like in bigger samples, most of the people tend to assume that we're in planet B rather than planet A, which is the more hostile one. Everybody's left to fend for themselves. It does seem like there's something about a crisis that really brings out this intuition of, you know, I need to protect my own life before others. But it does, like when we reflect on like earthquakes in Japan, or like I grew up in Israel. In Israel, I grew up lots of terror attacks and, you know, buses and restaurants exploding. You tend to think like people maybe are going to panic or people are going to, you know, just do what it is that's good for them. But I encountered from personal experience that actually very much aligned more with planet A. Suddenly everybody is helping each other. Everybody is risking their own lives in order to help others. So I think our basic intuition about mankind is perhaps that we'll be more like planet B. But when it comes to actual practice, and I'll give you some examples, we tend to be more of planet A. So let me share with you why I'm asking all these things. A book came out, Humankind, about a year ago, which I strongly recommend to you. I tried to get this into the library. I have 2 copies in my office if you want to come and borrow this. Strongly recommended. And what is remarkable about this book is that this book, for the first time, summarized what it is that I've been trying to teach at HKU for the past 4 years. And what it does is that we go step by step, looking at social psychology findings and trying to see whether the social psychology findings that we're going to discuss today, what do they show about human nature? And this book is advocating that, you know, Humankind, a hopeful history by Rutger over here, that says that there's a lot to be hopeful about in this world. There's lots of room for optimism because we tend to assume all sorts of things about people, but actually when it comes to all sorts of things, all sorts of bad things about people, but when it comes to actual practice, people tend to be much better than that. Before I show you some of the findings, last thing that I want to discuss with you is that when we talk about social psychology findings that you saw in your introduction to psychology, what famous experiments in social psychology do you remember? I'm going to open this up. I'm going to show the results. So you can just write whatever it is that you remember, or just tell me names of experiments or things that you remember from introduction to psychology. What kind of things tell us something about human nature? Remember any classic effect? Oh, okay, Lucifer effect. What is the Lucifer effect? Although I know it's not credible. How do you know? Okay, what is the Lucifer effect, just so we understand? The Stanford Prison experiment. Why are you saying that it's not solid? Interesting. So where did you hear about this? Yeah, so Stanford Prison experiment and the Lucifer effect talks about an experiment in a prison, Stanford Prison, right? And the results were showing that what? Under the right circumstances, people turn evil. You know, the jailers become very aggressive and hostile towards the the prisoners. Very good. The Milgram experiment, terrific. Yeah. Bystander effect and social loafing. Yeah, interesting. So all these are effects that we're going to discuss today because we want to see if they're really solid or not solid. But in every introduction to psychology, in every introduction to social psychology, in every social psychology book, Stanford Prison experiment, the bystander effect, the Milgram experiments, they keep coming up, all with the same bottom line. People are inherently bad, or that under the right circumstances, people are very easily corrupted if you just put them in the right circumstances. So I'll ask you for each one of those, the bystander effect, what do you think? Yes, the results are people do not help strangers. You know the results, but you think they help strangers, or you don't know about these results, or you don't think that they're true. So I'll ask you about this, about the bystander effect. I'll ask you about the Stanford Prison experiment, and then I'll ask you about the Milgram obedience experiment. So if you don't know any of these, that's completely okay. If you know about this, just share your opinion about whether they're, what the results are and whether they're solid or not. Okay, so I'll let you run these through. Now, when I read this book at least, so it covers a lot of findings. It covers findings from history. The person is a historian. Covers anthropology, biology. It's a really great book that covers everything from the beginning of time until today, a bit like Homo Sapiens with Yuval Noah Harari, if you know that book. Quite inspirational, but it tells a different tale of what human nature is. And to me, the social psychology part is remarkable. So after I listened to this, after doing a hike and listening to the audiobook, half a day of just listening to this, I went on Twitter and then I wrote this, that we social psychologists really need to discuss this humankind. I finished listening to this audiobook yesterday, putting aside inspirational message. I think that social psychologists should read the chapters regarding the classic findings in social psychology. I've been teaching this for 3 years before this came out. And this is my lecture. So you can go and look at my lectures from previous years. And basically he takes chapter by chapter, everything that I've been teaching the HKU students and doing investigative work where he goes into archives and he digs in deep to see how reliable is the Stanford Prison experiment, how reliable is the Milgram experiment. And he actually shows the bottom line is findings about humans are inherently bad. These findings are flawed. So I'm going to show you some of the flaws in the basic texts about social psychology and what is wrong about Stanford Prison experiment, what is wrong with the bystander effect. And we'll go through these one by one. Now, other really nice things about this is that he exposed me to some other things that I didn't know about. For example, this thing that we just did right now with experimental philosophy that came from Tom over here, who is a professor of social psychology in the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And he's been giving these questions, for example, planet A and planet B, to students for years. And this is what he writes. I would estimate that 97% of people think that we live in planet B, the evil planet, where nobody is helping each other and everybody is very, very selfish. But the truth is, in almost every case, we live in planet A. So our intuition is that in times of crisis, people are just going to fend for themselves and protect themselves. But what we actually see is that in times of crisis, people tend to help one another and even give up their own lives in order to help perfect strangers. So it doesn't matter who you ask, left wing, right wing, rich or poor, educated or uneducated or well-read, all make the same error of judgment. And this is a very fundamental error of judgment. We really need to understand why we have this basic intuition and why it's so far away from reality. And I blame me. I blame social psychology. I blame the textbooks because we brainwashed you to think that we're inherently bad. But I'm going to show you that some of these findings are very, very flawed. And actually, there's a different path to take. It took us a very, very long time. And it started only after the replication crisis that we started questioning these findings. I'm going to show you some big journals in psychology that did re-investigations of archives into some of these findings and some exciting, amazing, new big findings from social psychology in the last decade that actually show that we're much more planet A than we are planet B. Another source of bias is Hollywood. I blame Hollywood for all of that. Because, for example, when we think about Titanic, I don't know, did you watch Titanic, the movie? Very big when I was younger. So when this came out, the ultimate romantic movie. But if you look at the scene of the Titanic sinking, actually what you see is complete panic. Everybody's running around. Everybody's just trying to get on the boat. They don't care about, you know, the elderly or the young. Everybody's just jumping on the ships to the point that you need guns in order to threaten them. And the people who are the captain on the boat who stays last, so he sacrifices himself, wants to make everything orderly, but it's very, very difficult because there's lots of panic. One of the things that Rutger in Humankind did is he dug through the archives and he wanted to see what really happened during the Titanic. And this is what happened in reality. This is a quote from some of the archives that he found and you know, interviews with people who actually were in the Titanic in the 1960s. There was no indication of panic or hysteria, no cries or fear. So this is from the story of the Titanic as told by the survivors in New York in 1960. People were helping one another. People were getting the elderly, the young, and the women onto the boats. People were sacrificing themselves, which is very, very different from the Hollywood Titanic movie scene. If you want, go and have a look at this and see just how ridiculous and how extreme this is. And the question is, on one side, we have psychologists like me. On the other side, we've got the media and Hollywood telling us, you know, what happens when we're in crisis and how bad we inherently are. And the question is, why is this important? Why should we talk about these kinds of things? Another thing from the book, Humankind, that I really like. So this is a story. An old man says to his grandson, "There is a fight going on inside me. It's a terrible fight between two wolves. One is evil, angry, greedy, jealous, arrogant, cowardly. The other is good, peaceful, loving, modest, generous, honest, and trustworthy. These two wolves are also fighting within you, and inside every other person too." After a moment, the boy asks, "Which wolf will win?" The old man smiles, "The one that you feed." So if we get social psychologists and Hollywood to tell us a narrative about ourselves that is inherently bad, sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy where we're building this perception of ourselves. Finally, when there are situations like that, this is actually what might happen. Or our expectations of others is that this is how they will act. So we in advance already preempt in order to fight their predictably negative behavior, even though they might not act negatively at all. So it's very, very important to talk about this. I also make the connection to one of the strongest findings in psychology overall. People see this as a finding in medicine, but actually it's a finding about psychology. The remarkable thing is the placebo effect. So when we do medical interventions, we don't have an experimental condition versus control conditions where, you know, one is giving a treatment and one is giving no treatment. Because if you compare this to no treatment, this is not a good enough test. Usually we have three conditions. What are the three conditions? Experimental with a drug, no drug, and the placebo. Why do we need this placebo effect? Because the remarkable thing about the placebo effect is that even if we give people a sugar pill, or we give them an injection that has absolutely nothing, no vaccination and no treatment, the mind is connected to the body, and we are able to affect the immune system to do all sorts of things. It doesn't, you know, work in every time. So obviously, with things like pandemic, COVID, cancer, and all that, the effects of placebo are limited. But if we want to approve FDA, we want to know whether a medical treatment works or not, we shouldn't compare this to no treatment. We should compare this to the placebo effect because we want to know what is psychological and what is the actual pharmaceutical or treatment, medical treatment, and the impact on that. I won't go into this, but making the connection between what the mind does and the connection between the mind and the body is really important for placebo. It's not the focus on this course, but if you want to know more about this excellent podcast called Science Versus that I listen to, I've been listening to this for a very long time. And the nice thing about this podcast is that it verifies, it does fact checking, and it relies on up-to-date scientific articles. So at the end of every episode, they count how many citations there are, and they look at whether the citations are recent and solid. So they have people who are dedicated to this. And this is an excellent one from 2019 about the placebo effect. And the one thing I want you to take away from this, and also listen to TED, who they interview in their video, is that there is a very strong connection between the mind and the body, and we can come to believe in all sorts of things, and this affects our reality. So when we come to the doctor, when we make an appointment, when we schedule this in our calendar, when we go to the doctor, when the doctor smiles to us, when the doctor asks us how we're doing, when the doctor, spends time, writes all sorts of things, shows affection and empathy, gives us a pill, even if this has nothing in it, just sugar pill, this already is causing us to feel better. On the opposite side, if they do all sorts of things that are negative, if our experience with this is very, very negative, it also has negative downsides to that. So in general, we have a lot of cognitive biases. Placebo effect is very, very strong. We discussed already the negativity bias, the confirmation bias, the expectancy bias, the availability heuristic, all sorts of biases that are affecting us in order to, like, if we believe about people that they're inherently bad, this is how we're going to treat them. Negativity bias is that even if you have 100 things that are positive, 100 positive evaluations, 100 positive grades, then you have this one nagging fail, or you have one nagging bad evaluation, then you remember the negative a lot more than the positive. But we need to overcome these biases in order to understand that actually there's lots of good in the world. But we don't really get to hear much about the other side of the positives when people acted very, very good in these kinds of situations. So let's go into some of the findings. Lost wallets. Yes. So this paper came out in 2019, and they did something really remarkable. Social psychologists don't often publish anything in Science, but this was published in Science, so big finding. They took tens of thousands, I think 17,000 wallets around the world in many, many countries. And they left the wallets in the street, and they left, of course, an email in there. And they wanted to know how many of these wallets will be returned to their owners. And they did this with no money, a little money, or a lot of money. So if we go to the Mentimeter, my question is, try and predict, let's say we focus only on the US without looking at cross-cultural, what percentage of the wallets will be returned to their owners? 0, no wallets, 100% all the wallets, when it contains no money, when it contains a little bit of money, like $13.50 US dollars, or contains high amounts of money, almost $100 US dollars. So what's your predictions over here? What do you expect before I show you the results? What do you think most people would answer here? What is the general expectation here? If we are evil, what would we see here? Yeah, more negative, the larger the amount, right? So, something like that. Yeah, that's the ultimate evil, and return nothing. But generally, because we know there's always a distribution, if we want to kind of predict differences between them, you're saying if we're evil and we care about money and selfish, the more money there is in the wallet, the less people will return us. If we are good, what happens if we're good? The opposite from what you said, closer to the other, the higher end. So these are your predictions. Let's see your predictions. About the same, I guess. Somewhere in between, in the 50, 50, 57, 63. So some of you have some like negative intuitions over here. Some of you have very positive intuitions over here, like 100%. Interesting to see this. So now I'm going to show you the results of this. This is the abstract. I really think this is the kind of work that I would want to do because it really says something very, very interesting. If I could choose any replication to do, I would like to do replications of these kinds of things, but this was just conducted in 2019, so it's very recent. So we examined the trade-off between honesty and self-interest using a field experiment in 355 cities spanning 40 countries around the globe. In these experiments, we turned in more than 17,000 lost wallets containing varying amounts of money at public and private institutions and measured whether recipients contacted their owners to return the wallets. In virtually all countries, citizens were more likely to return wallets that contain more money. Citizens were more likely to return wallets that contain more money. Yeah, there could be also, there are some stuff in there. You can actually go in and read the methodology, but not a lot of very important things. Just, but yeah, that's a good point, and we'll come back to this point in like two or three slides. But I want to show you the findings. And before I tell you what I think about these findings, I want you to look at these findings and tell me what you think about these findings. And these are the findings. We have two different, we have the left part and the right part. So here we see, for example, comparing Poland, United Kingdom, and the United States. We have no money, money, and big money. What do you see about the left one? What's your interpretation of the left one? Yes, but it could also be the incentive for taking it, right? So people do emphasize that they see the money as being important to the other person rather than more for me, right? So it is more about good than bad. Or do you see something else that I'm not seeing? Yeah, there's some cost involved. And then you see what is the benefit? Is this really valuable and important to the person versus how much effort I need to exert, right? So if there's more money, perhaps it's more important for the person I need to return this. Yeah, but this is definitely more aligned with people are good narrative because they don't see more money as, oh, more money for me, that's great, we can just steal. But more money, it's important to the person, so I need to return this. Now, anything interesting about this countries from all around the world? So up here we've got, I don't know, Scandinavians going like Israel is somewhere here in the middle with the United States, the UK. What's your observation about the right one? First of all, cross-cultural differences. So you were talking about cross-cultural differences before. There seems to be cross-cultural differences. I'll tell you what is the first thing that came up for people in Hong Kong. And this is because this was in South China Morning Post. So this was a big headline. And the people are, what the hell is going on with China? So why is China over here? And people were very upset about this, especially people in mainland China, but also people in Hong Kong is like, what is going on with this? What does this represent? Does this really represent something that's solid? Is it something that you're interested in? Because I was curious about this. So I was fascinated to read the South China Morning Post. Now, before I show you what they wrote, I want you to reflect. If let's say you're from mainland China and you see this kind of result and you feel angry about this, and you want to explain this, what could be possible reasons for you to think why China is here compared to, let's say, the West? First of all, they saw this as, oh, these Westerners did the study and they wanted to show. But let's think about methodological reasons. What could explain this? Now, I'll tell you the setup. The setup was, in all of the countries, they took the wallet that was probably lost. They went into a hotel. They went to the receptionist in the hotel and they told the receptionist, I found this wallet in the street. I'm going to leave it here with you. And then they wanted to see whether the receptionists are going to use the email in the wallet in order to send this back to the person. Now, what could be problems about this in the mainland China context? They can't use Gmail. Okay, so maybe they didn't do some adjustments in the methodology. They should use 163.com or something like that, right? Yeah? Good point. So maybe some adjustment by email. Anything else about email? Not only Gmail doesn't work. What else? Seldom use email. What do they use? WeChat? I don't know. What else? What do mainland people? Not email. Or email is like down the, something that people don't really use unless they want to speak to these foreigners. Yeah, okay, no email. Anything else? What else could be? Last time I visited mainland China, nobody had a wallet. Why didn't they have wallets? Because everything is with WeChat Pay, Alipay, everything is with mobiles and scanning the barcode. So you go to a restaurant, there's this barcode on the side, you scan this and it orders and they bring it off to you. Even homeless people and street vendors, everybody's got these barcodes. Nobody uses cash anymore. Many places, even taxi drivers, when I got the cash, they're like, I don't know what to do with this cash, so please don't give me cash. So for them, cash is not even something. So already we see two other aspects. So when we do cross-cultural studies, it's very important for us to understand the culture that we're going into. So I was fascinated by this whole thing. Why Chinese score lower the European American research, just the headline is amazing. The Chinese score lowest in European American research team about honesty study, but the method might be flawed. So they went in and talked to Professor Wu Ling in Wuhan University. He's a professor of sociology. And he says there might be some problems in their methods. And I think these are valid concerns, all sorts of things about them. So first of all, he studied a very specific group of people, receptionists working at the counter. So receptionists in mainland China working in hotels and all that are under very high pressure and strain. So this distorted the findings. The receptionists might have put it aside because they didn't have too much time or didn't contain enough information. Plus, there was no important personal items like credit cards, ID, or driving license. So there's just like nobody's using cash anyway. So just we're going to put this aside and we don't care about this. Plus, just like you said, most Chinese citizens do not use email for their daily communication. So I really think it's fascinating to look at one of these like science papers, see some of the findings and see if something doesn't hold up. But I think these are very interesting discussions of what can we learn from this kind of thing. So one of the things I would love to do is like a replication of this again, man, in China and Hong Kong with some adjustments to the cultural aspect. But I feel like it's really good to have this kind of discussion, which would allow us to, what would a study about human nature need to be like if we want to study this in mainland China or in Hong Kong. In addition, I wanted you to see this graph. So here we see what the prediction rates are. So people ask non-expert samples, what do you think the findings are going to be? The findings that they predicted are, that the more money there's, the more money that's in there, the less people are going to give this back. They expected people to give back, but they expected people give back much less for big money than in little money, and in little money than no money. So they assumed selfish behavior. You ask social psychologists, so they asked an expert sample, what do you expect? And they basically said, no big differences, but we do expect a little bit less for the big money. But actually the results are, especially for the US, you see this big incline. So social psychologists are wrong. Our intuitions are wrong. In reality, a lot more people help when it seems like it's important and there's more money in the wallet. So I think that's remarkable, and there's lots of stuff that we can think about. And if this is interesting for you, maybe next year you want to do a thesis or something, that's a really interesting replication to run, although you need some money to be able to just like give away some wallets and not care if you get these back or not. But this is about the bystander effect. So I'm going to show you a BBC clip on the bystander effect.
Watch a pickpocket in action. The woman with the rucksack is his victim, and the man in the grey top on the left is the thief. Except they're both acting. In fact, everyone in the queue is with us, apart from the man in the blue shirt. As the thief moves in, will our bystander notice? He clearly has. What's more, he's seen that other people in the queue have noticed too. Now, what's he going to do about it? The answer is nothing. After all, no one else in the queue reacts, so why should he? Chances are, you wouldn't have done anything either. Whatever the man in the blue shirt thinks he's seen, he's influenced by the apathy of everyone else in the queue. In more serious situations, this could have disturbing consequences. Liverpool Street Station in London. A drunk lies on the pavement. In fact, he's our actor, Peter, but these passers-by aren't to know that. And since he looks the worse for wear, not critically ill, they ignore him. Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow. This time, we've dressed Peter as a respectable city gent. How long before he's rescued now that he looks the part?
Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm all right, thanks.
6 seconds. She even calls him sir. And suddenly, everyone's a good Samaritan.
Do you suffer from epilepsy?
No.
While you're lying on the floor in the rain?
After a couple of minutes, even the police turn up.
I would just hate to be in his position of feeling ill and nobody helping and walking past, so I'd just like to check that he was okay.
I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be ill because he's going to ruin his suit anyway.
Our actress Ruth takes Peter's place. She's not a drunk, but she's also not a city gent. How long before she gets help? Four minutes have passed, and 34 people have passed.
People don't really want to know that they just haven't got the time. Well, they have got the time, they just don't want to get involved.
But it's more complicated than that. If the street were deserted, a passerby would probably go to the rescue. But these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't help. This woman, for instance, has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing.
You all right? You all right?
Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You all right? You sure?
She suddenly finds herself in a different group with a new rule: to help.
She don't look well, does she?
You all right? Yeah. You sure?
First I thought she was dead. Then I sort of checked to see if she was breathing or not. And I looked around and I couldn't believe that no one had noticed her, because there was a bloke sat there just absorbed in reading a newspaper.
Peter's now having the same problem. This time, we've swapped his suit for casual clothes. He's not drunk, and we've asked him to act like he's in pain.
Help! Help! Help me! Please, somebody! Help me! Help me, somebody! Please help me! Help me! Help me! Help me! Please, somebody help me! Please, somebody help me!
Kind of difficult to see somebody crying out for help like that and not being helped, right? Did you happen to watch the Squid Games? Did you finish all the season 1 Squid Games? You did? Do you remember what happened in the last episode? I'm not gonna ruin it for you. It's a mind-blowing kind of season, but it talks about the bystander effect, and there's actually a bet between the person who's running the operation and one of the participants about whether somebody is going to be helped or not. So interesting to kind of reflect on these things. And the question is, does this hold? So where did this start? This started in 1968 with the bystander effect. And basically what they were trying to show is that if there are other people around, people generally take a lot longer, if ever, to respond. But if they're the only people there, the people will respond much faster. So if you look at kind of like the general proportion, is that when it was one-on-one, 85% of people helped. Not exactly the bystander effect where no people are helping, 85% help. So the bystander effect is not about nobody is helping, but it's about whether there's other people around you, yes or no. And the main claim is that one-on-one is 85%, and in a group is 31%. So already our understanding of what the bystander effect is, where nobody is helping and everybody is just like looking at the person over there on the street, it's not necessarily like this, because even in the video, it took a while, but finally there was a person that approached a woman. So it's not zero, it's not nobody is helping under no circumstances, but they were claiming in the bystander effect that when there's a group and there's other people around and there's a norm for not helping, then people are not risking themselves. Meta-analysis from 1981. So aggregating all the studies together from 1968 until 1981, all the bystander effect, what they concluded was robust across all emergency types and populations, where overall helping may increase or decrease because of the variety of issues. The pattern of less helping with bystanders stood up. So they've identified all kinds of reasons for why people don't help, and you really need a lot of things in order for people to help. Even though, like the original one, 85% one-on-one, but generally you need to notice the incident, just like the person with the wallet. So he clearly noticed it? Do they interpret this as an emergency? Do they assume responsibility? And this is, how do other people around me are reacting? If they don't react to this, maybe I shouldn't react as well. And if all of these happen, then people do try and help. Okay, so all sorts of challenges. First, it's not clear if people are noticing the event, and then it's not clear how they're interpreting this event. Sometimes there are all sorts of things like pluralistic ignorance. So this is very common. I give a lot of talks, and sometimes all sorts of things are happening with me. And sometimes people are struggling giving talks, and they're saying, it's so obvious that I need help so much. How come nobody is coming? And then people are on saying, maybe she needs some help, but others are not moving. Probably she's okay. So there is something about the lack of interaction where it's not clear what's happening with the other person, and we need to interpret what's happening with the other person, and we use cues from other people around us. So pluralistic ignorance. And the question is, this bystander effect finding, this social psychology experiment, where did it start? Actually, it started 4 years earlier than that. So there's the famous Kitty Genovese case that happened in New York City that prompted a lot of things in New York City. So there was a case where somebody was murdered, and the New York Times story that went on and triggered a lot of social psychology experiments is that it seemed like nobody was helping. 2 years ago, when I did this slide, it was the date when the infamous murder of Kitty Genovese died in prison at age 81. And already it talks about some of the issues with the Kitty Genovese story. So the Kitty Genovese story was one thing, but actually when they did some investigation of what happened, they saw some other things. So let's see the investigation of what happened in the year 1964.
It was Kitty Genovese, a woman whose murder became infamous the world over because nobody tried to save her. Listen to how it was reported.
At least 38 residents of this apartment building heard her screams and did nothing.
That's the legacy of Kitty Genovese, who was murdered in Queens, New York in 1964. Her story is taught in psychology classes, and her name is synonymous with people who look the other way when trouble happens.
Nothing, no witnesses, just a lot of listeners. It's the post-Kitty Genovese era. No one wants to look, they think they'll get involved.
In 1964, Kitty Genovese was murdered outside her home in the middle of the night.
Incredibly, last Sunday's episode of HBO's Girls featured a staged reenactment of the Kitty Genovese case.
Dad, I think there's a lady in the courtyard.
It can't be anything good this time of night.
Hearing of Winston Moseley's death, Girls creator Lena Dunham wrote on Instagram, "Today we learn her killer has died. Spooky timing. Rest in peace, Kitty." So what really happened the night Kitty Genovese was murdered? Kevin Cook is the author of Kitty Genovese, The Murder, the Bystanders, the Crime That Changed America.
The idea that New Yorkers watched and did nothing, didn't lift a finger to help this poor dying girl, stuck in the public mind, but it was a lot more complicated than that.
It happened here. Kitty Genovese was almost home when she heard a man's footsteps behind her. She ran, but the man caught up to her and stabbed her twice in the back. She screamed, "Oh God, I've been stabbed." What happened next? That's where fact and fiction take separate paths.
He fled. She turned and went back around this corner.
Kitty was attacked by a man named Winston Moseley. The author says the fact that she was able to walk after the initial attack probably led people to believe they didn't have to call the cops.
People are looking out their windows. They see Kitty Genovese here. They see her struggle to her feet. She staggers around this corner into the darkness and is no longer visible to the people.
She's no longer visible to the people over here. It was past 3 a.m. Thinking the trouble was over, people went back to bed. They were unaware that a wounded Kitty Genovese was still in mortal danger.
Kitty sought shelter in here. She was able to get into this door.
That's when Moseley returned and raped and stabbed Kitty to death in this vestibule. According to Cook, a man at the top of the stairs saw it happen, but did nothing to stop it. A tragic story, but it got much worse 2 weeks later when a front-page story in the New York Times declared 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. The author says that number was totally distorted.
There were certainly dozens of ear witnesses and eyewitnesses, but when you talk about the people who both heard something or saw something and knew what it meant, knew what was going on, I don't think it's more than half a dozen.
And Cook says one neighborhood man remembers his dad calling the cops on that fateful night.
He swears that his father did call the police, was put on hold, told the police, there's a woman staggering around out there, she's been beaten up, you need to come. There was no answer to that call. In those days, there was no 911 system. That's something that grew out of the Kitty Genovese case.
So the legend of Kitty Genovese was born.
Led to many sermons in churches, it led to gossip, it went viral in the way that things could in 1964.
Winston Moseley was arrested 6 days after the murder. When he died last week at the age of 81, he'd been denied parole 18 times. He was one of the longest serving inmates in New York State history.
So it's really remarkable that open a social psychology book, Bystander Effect, you'll see the case of Kitty, but actually a lot of the things in Kitty's story just don't hold up very well. And it's not just this video that I showed you right now, but actually we have articles in social psychology from 2007. So this is from American psychologists. So this is a very reputable journal that looked into Kitty Genovese many, many years later. And the story, this myth of the 38 witnesses, and this is what they wrote. This whole thing about 38 witnesses who remained inactive during the murder of Kitty Genovese is not supported by the available evidence. So if you just have a look at what actually happened during that case, if you look at the archives, if you look at the calls, if you interview the people, the authors show that there is no evidence for the presence of 38 witnesses, or that witnesses observed the murder, or that witnesses remained inactive. So if we go further into this, we see all kinds of other books that came out. Still, in social psychology books, this is not reflected, but front page reports in the New York Times incorrectly identified 38 indifferent witnesses to the crime, fueling fears of apathy and urban decay. So New York Times did a big mistake about the way that they reported this sort of thing. And the most remarkable thing that came out is that they tried to correct this in 2016. There was no question that the attack occurred, but the portrayal of 38 witnesses as fully aware and unresponsive was an error. So the biggest case that fueled the bystander effect that we keep reporting in social psychology books was a mistake. The article grossly exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they had perceived. None saw the attack in its entirety. Only a few had glimpsed part of it, or recognized the cries for help. Many thought that they had heard lovers or drunks quarreling. There were 2 attacks, not 3, and afterwards, 2 people did call the police. And back then there was no 911, so calling the police is, putting on hold 3 in the morning, getting the person to actually, get your attention. And 70-year-old woman ventured out and cradled the dying victim in her arms until they arrived. And the police did arrive. Miss Genovese died on the way to the hospital. So it's not like everybody ignored, nobody cared. People cared. People in 3 in the morning called the police. People cared. 3 in the morning went outside, held her. Finally, ambulance came and took her. So what we think we know in 1964 and what actually happened is very, very different. Finally, this is the woman who ventured out in order to cradle her. It would take decades for a more complicated truth to unravel, including the fact that one neighbor actually raced out from her apartment to rescue Miss Genovese, knowing that she was in distress but unaware whether her assailant was still on the scene. So putting herself at risk because she didn't know if the murderer is there or not. It's clear that she went into great efforts to save and comfort Kitty, giving the lie to the idea that nobody helped and nobody cared. A remarkable ending to this story. It took from 1964 until this decade in order to revisit this. What happens with the bystander effect? This is a meta-analysis from 2011, so before the replication crisis started, and we looked at findings. So even this needs to be looked at carefully with caution. But this is their conclusion from meta-analysis of all the bystander effects. The overall effect size of 7,700 participants is minus 0.35. Now you know what this kind of effect size means. So somewhere between weak and medium. But the bystander effect was attenuated. So less of a bystander effect was when it was perceived as dangerous. So the more dangerous, the more people helped. This is exactly the opposite, just like in the Lost Wallet case. Perpetrators were present. More people helped when the perpetrators were still there. And cost of intervention were physical. So people put themselves in physical harm in order to help others, the bystanders. So if anything, the bystander effect is reversed, is weakened when there are all these kinds of circumstances. People, so this story about nobody wants to help does just not hold up. And the nicest one, just like with the lost wallets, is this new study that came out in the last 2-3 years, where they analyzed CCTV footage. So rather than doing experiments or looking at stories in the New York Times, they actually looked at what's happening by analyzing CCTV footage of real cases, and this is what they found.
That idea of us being individuals that are only interested in our own interests, that is not how it works. The myth is that when people observe somebody in need of help in public, then they have a tendency to kind of just stand there and look at each other. Our research shows that that's not at all what's happening. From pretty low-scale conflicts to stabbings and really severe violence. In all types of situations, they try to de-escalate the conflict. They put themselves between the conflict parties, trying to pull them apart. So is it always a good idea to play an active role, Is it also a good idea to be active if you are in an armed robbery situation? We were surprised by the high frequency of it, and we were also surprised by seeing similar frequencies in these 3 different countries that we looked at. As a cultural anthropologist, I would have expected pretty big cultural differences, but what we see is that there are some universal features in these very tense situations. A lot of social psychologists would be pretty upset if I would say that I disproved it. In many ways, I think we did, but the point is that they've been looking at something else than what we've been looking at. So our point now is a bit, now with the CCTV footage, we can actually gain understanding of human behavior in a way that we haven't been able to get before. Violence and aggression, you can't study that in a lab setting. The urgency is different in real life. So that idea, if you stumble when you enter the subway and people will not help you, that's not what we see. That's an idea that we all have, but that's not how the reality works.
Yeah, so to me, this is really inspirational. So 90% of people actually came in and intervened. And you can read this also in the American Psychologist that really seems to care about these issues. Would I be helped? Cross-national CCTV footage shows that intervention is the norm. Intervention is the norm. This is so far away from what social psychology books are telling us. So really, we should revisit this. So they looked at this in the United Kingdom, in the Netherlands, and in South Africa. 9 out of 10 public conflicts, at least one bystander, typically several, will do something to help. How easy it is to corrupt us. So now we're getting to the Stanford Prison experiment. We don't have time to look at the video. So if you don't remember what the Stanford Prison experiment is, please go and watch the video. What I will tell you is that, just like you said about some bad findings regarding this experiment. So this is the headline: famed Stanford Prison experiment was a fraud. It was a fraud. It's just not an experiment. Now we know because we dug the archives and we have actually everything that Zimbardo wrote. And he actually staged the whole thing. There's nothing scientific about it. This is from Simin Vazir, who is the, one of the proponents for open science. Psychologists, please read this. We must stop celebrating this work. It's anti-scientific. Get it out of the textbooks. It's still in every textbook. You open social psychology textbooks, you'll see the Stanford Prison experiment. It's not an experiment. It's a hoax by Zimbardo, and it really should be kicked out of the whole thing. The final clip about the summary of this whole thing, just like you said about the acting.
I had really thought that I was incapable of this kind of behavior.
I gotta go to a doctor, anything. Jesus Christ, I'm burning up inside, don't you know? I want out! I want out
Yeah, we really want this out of the textbooks, but it's really difficult to change the social psychology textbooks. So somebody needs to talk about these things. If you want to read more about this, this is the blog post where they did some real investigative work. They got Stanford to expose their archives. They looked at all the notes by Zimbardo. They interviewed each and every one of the people involved. One of the jailers was a graduate student that really wanted to get into Stanford, so he wanted to appease his professor. All sorts of stuff that just like blows your mind about the story. Really shoddy stuff. You can just go through this and read about this. These are the headlines that came out of this. The Stanford Prison experiment was massively influential. We just learned that this was a fraud. So all this happened in 2018. So starting from when the Stanford Prison was, with all the books, everything that came out, all the media attention, until 2018, we really thought the Stanford Prison experiment. I learned psychology with this being one of the biggest findings in psychology, but now we know this is really shoddy. How about replications of this work? We've tried replications a few times. This is from the British Journal of Social Psychology. You can see over here, Rethinking the Psychology of Tyranny, the BBC prison study. This is what they found. Unlike the prisoners, the guards failed to identify with their roles. This made the guards reluctant to impose their authority, and they were eventually overcome by the prisoners. Participants then established an egalitarian social system. Prisoners and jailers sat together in a commune, sang songs, helped one another. This is the end of the replication of the Stanford experiment. Plus, if you want to see how the BBC, ran the experiment, they were really looking for drama and looking how the jailers and the prisoners looking, hurting one another, aggression. But what they found, if you watch this, it's kind of like a very boring TV show because nothing happens over there. There is no real aggression. There is no, all the big drama that the Stanford Prison experiment was expecting. If you want a summary of the whole thing, once again, with American psychologists, which seems to debunk again and again, debunking the Stanford Prison experiment. So you can just look at all the findings, all the archives, everything from Zimbardo, showing that really we need to take this out of the social psychology. Now, final one I'm going to talk about is Milgram. We don't have much time, so I'm going to do this very, very shortly. The basic thing about the Milgram experiments is that you've got a person with authority in a white coat who is the experimenter. and they're telling the participant to shock another person who is in the other room. Allegedly, there's no other person. This is all pretend. And at some point, the other person is saying that they're feeling hurt, that they're getting shocked, and they want to stop the experiment. And then the experimenter tells the participant, you must proceed. The experiment requires that you proceed. And they wanted to see how many people go all the way to the end, keep shocking the person, increasing the dosage, even when it seems like they're doing real harm to the person on the other side. Unfortunately, unlike the bystander effect and the Stanford Prison experiment, we are able to replicate Milgram experiment. We've replicated this again and again. Milgram did a very good job over here. So there is some kind of bad side to human behavior. And over here, we see a replication from 2006. Obedience rates in 2006 replication were only slightly lower than those in Milgram found 45 years earlier, with about 80% kept going and giving deadly electric shocks all the way to the end and abiding to the authority of the experimenter in the white coat. In addition, when we did this TV show, The Heist, try to replicate this thing, you can watch the video if you click on this to see how they conducted the Milgram experiment. And you will see that they were able to get very similar results to the one by Milgram. This is a meta-analysis, a meta-Milgram, that shows that 740 participants from 23 small samples showed that obedience involved progression to the maximum voltage, overall 43.6%. So somewhere between 40% to 80% are people that are willing to obey an authority that tells them to harm another person. So it seems like there is something within us that can be corrupted when there are the right circumstances. A person in authority is telling us to proceed. All sorts of explanations for that. We're not going to go into this in much more detail. The most recent one that I found, 2017, from Poland, the results achieved show a level of participants' obedience towards instructions similarly high to that of the original Milgram study. So I would have liked to tell you that we're inherently good, but I cannot do that. All I can say is that the evidence showing that we're inherently bad is flawed. We need to do a lot more research, perhaps for you, when you do your graduate studies or wherever it is that you go to next, you'll be able to look more into this. You can look at this with social psychology experimental methods, but the one finding that seems to replicate very, very well is this one. There are certain circumstances that lead us to be corrupted. Next week, in the following one, we're going to talk about morality and unethical behavior. When are people more moral or immoral, more ethical or unethical? So this is something that's going to be following us for the next few weeks. How to conclude? This is my summary. There is no evidence that human nature is inherently bad. The classic findings in social psychology are completely biased and flawed. I would remove most of the social psychology textbook chapters discussing all these findings. We really need to update those. Replications show, if anything, tendency for helping in prosociality. So lost wallets plus the CCTV footage shows that we have in us the capacity to do good and help one another, especially in times of crisis, especially when putting us in danger and there's real need from the other side. However, human nature, and we'll show this in the following weeks, can be affected by in-group, out-group bias. Morality is very complex, so we'll discuss how to determine what morality is. Authority power seems to corrupt. The last thing that I want to show you is this final words from Rutger. So I don't know if you'll end up reading the book or not. I really think that you should. Both of his books are exceptional, and he's now considered a world thinker. You'll see many of his debates with Yuval Noah Harari, with Steven Pinker. He goes into big conferences and tries to promote this message of people can be very good if you expect them to be good. Published this during the pandemic. So here he reflects about this choice, what this says, and his hopeful message for the world.
My name is Rutger Bregman, and I'm the author of the new book, Humankind, A Hopeful History. It's a book about a simple but quite radical idea. What if most people, deep down, are pretty decent? In the past 15 to 20 years, there has been a silent revolution in science. Scientists from very diverse disciplines, psychologists, anthropologists, archaeologists, sociologists, have moved from a quite cynical view of human nature to a much more positive and hopeful view, and have actually been arguing that we are hardwired to be friendly and to cooperate, and that actually this is our true superpower as a species. Now, I think this is a quite revolutionary idea, because what you assume in other people is what you get out of them. If you assume that most people deep down are just selfish, as we have been assuming for the past 30 to 40 years, then you'll start designing your institutions around that idea, right? Your schools, your workplaces, your democracies, and that's what you get out of people. What you assume in other people is what you get out of them. Now, if we move to a new, more hopeful, more realistic view of human nature, I think that changes everything. And it's also a quite subversive idea, because if we don't trust each other, if we think that, people are deep down are just selfish, then we need them, then we need the CEOs and the presidents and the bureaucrats and the generals and the monarchs and the kings and you name it. We need those in power to keep each other in check. But if we actually believe in each other, if we believe that most people can be trusted, then we can move to a very different kind of society, a much more egalitarian kind of society where, we bring out the best in each other. That's the simple but quite radical idea that I'm defending in my book, Humankind, A Hopeful History. Now, it's a strange time to be publishing a book. I've worked on this for 5 years. For 5 years, I've tried to connect the dots, and I'm just trying to show that there's something bigger going on here, because there are so many brilliant specialists who have been working on this new view of human nature, but they often don't realize from each other that they're not alone. So at one point I was interviewing a psychologist who had been doing fascinating work on the so-called bystander theory, which is the idea that during times of crises or when there's an emergency, say someone's drowning or someone's attacked in the street, that we don't help. And this psychologist actually showed that in 90% of all cases, based on CCTV camera footage, right? So real incidents, in 90% of all cases, people actually help each other. And so I told her about new theories from biology, where biologists lately have been talking about the concept of survival of the friendliest, which has been happening in our evolution. That for thousands of years, it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids and so had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. And I told her about this, and she said, "Oh my God, so it's been happening there as well." And this is the only thing that I've been trying to do, is just to connect the dots, to show that there's something bigger going on, that the zeitgeist is changing and that we're moving into a new era right now.
Yes, so both in social psychology, anthropology, sociologists, in biology, there's a group of us that are revisiting the question of human nature and finding something that's very different from our understanding from textbooks and the media and Hollywood, that we're inherently bad, in suggesting survival of the friendliest, that we're here to help one another and that we support one another, and that there is some hope even during these dark times. So that's it for this week. Replications and extensions. If you have any questions, we're available to you on Slack. Following weeks, we're going to talk about morality and ethicality. I'll see you then.